Getting a mix to sound really wide while still feeling really punchy and really forward is something that I see a lot of people struggle with. I think that a wide mix is so much more enjoyable for 90% of music that I listen to because I want to feel like I'm in the song. I like dense arrangements where everything kind of has its own place, and playing around with width is a good way to kind of make your mix be even more three-dimensional. So in this video today, what I want to do is talk about some of my favorite ways to add width to individual elements or to an entire mix. We're going to talk about things like arrangement and panning. We're going to talk about things like modulation effects. We're going to talk about time-based effects. We're going to talk about things like dynamic relationships between really narrow elements and really wide elements. And by the end of this video, you should be able to add a bit of width and a bit of space to your mix without everything getting too washy or too ambient. So we're going to dive in and check all of that out in 1 second. But before we do, my name is Austin. You're watching Make Pop Music. If you like this video, please make sure that you subscribe. We do them every single Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And if you want to go ahead and be entered for a chance to win a sample pack, preset pack, or MIDI pack from our website, Make Pop Music, just leave a comment within the first 72 hours. Anything goes. We pick the winners every week on our Instagram, so follow us over there and Make Pop Music. And make sure that you check out our store for all of the sample packs, preset packs, MIDI packs, loop packs. We have courses, tons of stuff over there. We also have a ton of freebies that you can download, so go check all of that out. There will be links in the description. Let's go ahead and dive in. First of all, I want to talk about width and what it even is and how our ears perceive it. So typically, when you're recording something or you're using a loop, a lot of times you will find that there is mono, which means that there is one sound source coming right up the middle of the stereo spectrum, or you can have things stereo, where there can kind of be a variation of, some things are really wide, some things are a little wide, some things kind of tilt over to one side. But the way that our ears kind of determine width is when there are elements happening on the left side of a spectrum and the right side of a spectrum, any discrepancies in time, any discrepancies in pitch, any discrepancies in timbre, our ears are able to pick that up. And when there are those little things, even if they're really, really minimal, it will start to create width. So there's a bunch of things that you can do. You can do panning, which is kind of the most basic. We're going to talk about that. You can do modulation, and you can do time-based effects. But just so you can kind of hear what something right down the middle of the stereo spectrum sounds like, let me show you a mono guitar. And I'm also going to pull up a phase meter so we can kind of look at how to check this out. So we're going to be looking at this right here. If something is perfectly down the middle, it will be at +1. If something is perfectly out of phase, it'll be at -1. And typically for a mix, you want it to be in the plus. Nothing is ever going to be perfectly in phase unless it's completely mono. But let me show you what that sounds like. You're going to see one line up the middle. So there's a good example of something that has no stereo width. Let me just show you something that has a little bit of stereo width in it so you can kind of see how different the meters look. We'll go over this in a bit more detail, but this is what a guitar with a chorus sounds like. And kind of pay attention to how this is not just one line up the middle. This is going to kind of bounce around. Versus this. Our ears can immediately pick up that there are things happening on the side. This is using a chorus. We're going to talk about that when we talk about modulation effects, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about what stereo width is and how we pick it up. It's basically the differences in time, timbre, and pitch happening on different sides of the stereo spectrum. You have 100% left, 100% right, and then kind of everything in between that. So now that we've talked about that, let's talk about the first way that I think that you can add width to literally any arrangement, and that's by simply panning. Doing things like creating your arrangement and then figuring out where everything is going to sit in that stereo field is an art form. There's no right or wrong way. I kind of have a different mindset when I'm doing things like drums versus vocals versus guitar. But let's take a quick example, right? We have this drum right here. It's a kick and snare, and it's kind of right up the middle. There might be a little bit of reverb or anything that's kind of adding some space, but nothing's panned. Let me pull up a scope so you can kind of see. Here's the kick and the snare. Pretty much right down the middle. The way that I like to pan something like drums and percussion is I'll kind of think of it like a drum kit. So we're pulling in a hi-hat, and for me, maybe I want the hi-hat to be a little bit off to the left, because if I'm sitting in front of a drum kit, the hi-hat is going to be a little bit off to my left. So I've panned that 26%. That's adding a little bit of width because now we have something only happening on the left side. Same thing with toms. If we have, rack toms over here, those are going to be 30% left, and then floor toms are going to be like 50% right, because if I'm sitting at a drum kit, that's kind of where they're happening. So when I'm panning things like drums and percussion, I kind of look at it like a practical standpoint of where would things in a kit sit? Typically, kick and snare are pretty up the middle. Sometimes I'll shift the snare to the left a little bit. Hi-hats always sit a little bit left. Crashes will kind of sit independently where I have them in the stereo spectrum. And then when I have extra layers like these little, auxiliary drums and things like that, I'll just pan these out to kind of give me something that feels interesting to my ear. There's no right or wrong answer for panning, but listen with this cowbell and this conga. The cowbell is kind of just spinning around, and then the conga is going to be happening on the right side, and then I have claps happening on the left. And that just adds quite a bit of space. If we go over to the chorus, you'll hear that some of the cymbals kind of widen out. And you can see here that if you look right here, I'm just panning different layers just to kind of give me a little bit of variation. I don't always want everything right down the middle, but panning is a good way to do that. Another great example for panning is by doing things like layering an element and spreading them out. So if we look over here, I have a lead vocal that is typically right down the middle. Sounds like this.
I was never one to lay my cards out on the table till we cross paths.
But sometimes if I need a little bit of extra width, you can do something like have what's called a dub, where if we go over here,
we're moving fast.
And what a dub is essentially you perform the same thing again. You can do it with guitars, you can do it with vocals, you can do it with synths, but you're creating a new performance because those time and pitch discrepancies, again, are what cause width. And for the verse, I decided I want them about 80% left and right. I don't want them super, super wide. I'm going to save that for the chorus because I'm trying to create a dynamic effect where we have a pretty centered lead vocal, we have some dubs happening here, and then in the chorus, we'll go all the way wide. I like to kind of play with push and pull and tension. And so that's a big way that I use panning. If we go over here, they come in about 90% for the pre-chorus.
I feel insane because I can't explain what we have.
And then when we get into the chorus, we're going 100% left and right because we want them super wide.
Mystery, it feels like a natural reaction. You had a spark and I caught flame like a matchstick.
And then when we add the lead under that.
Mystery, it feels like a natural reaction. You had a spark and I caught flame like a matchstick.
If we take out those panned layers, we just have this.
Mystery, it feels like a natural reaction. You had a spark and I caught flame like a matchstick.
So panning is a great way to add width, but adding a dub and panning those is a great way to also add width. You can just pan individual elements if it's something that you only want to happen on the left. You can do, kind of a soundscape thing like we did with the drums, or you can just double up things and kind of have them left and right. Just make sure that you don't simply duplicate it. What we want to do is create a whole new performance, because if you were to simply duplicate it and pan those left and right, there's no difference in pitch, there's no difference in timbre, and there's no difference in time. So they're just going to phase out, and you're just going to have something that is twice as loud right up the middle. So if you do want to use panning, make sure that you're kind of adding separate layers. You can't just duplicate things and pan them across. They're not really going to do too much. So there is no right or wrong reason. Let me kind of show you what it sounds like if we have a mix that really didn't have any panning in it. This is everything kind of summed to the middle. We still have some stereo stuff happening with like modulation and time-based effects that we'll talk about in a minute. But if we were to pan all the drums to the center, all the vocals to the center, all of the guitars to the center, this is what this sounds like.
It feels like a natural reaction. You had a spark and I caught flame like a matchstick.
Versus if we have my version.
It feels like a natural reaction. You had a spark and I caught flame like a matchstick. Instantly, that's chemical attraction.
And something that I'm really trying to pay attention to when I'm determining my panning is I really just want to think about, like, where do I want things to sit in the stereo arrangement, right? If I have guitars happening 50% left and right, maybe for my piano I have that only 30% left, and maybe for a violin I have that 70% right. I never really want things that kind of sit in the same like timbre region or in the same tone region. I never really want them in the same stereo region. I think of a mix very 3D. So if I have something that's kind of filling out the low end up the middle, maybe I'll have something that's kind of filling out the low mids on the left. And then maybe I'll have something that's kind of filling out the low mids on the right. But I'm never just having everything full spectrum, everything center, or everything fully wide. I'm kind of panning out things so they can kind of all have their own little pocket, whether that's timbre-wise, pitch-wise, tone-wise, or stereo spectrum-wise. Now that we've talked about my kind of mindset with panning and what panning is and what it does, let's talk about other ways that you can add width. Let's say that you don't just want to keep adding new elements. You don't want to pan a guitar completely to the left. You don't want to pan a hi-hat to the right. No matter what you want to do, there's other things that you can do that can add stereo width without having to do new performances or whatever. Again, we're going to take a look at that acoustic guitar that we had earlier. This is what it sounds like if it's just coming right down the middle. And I'll pull up a meter for you. Nice, boring. The first thing that we can do is we can have something called chorus. So chorus is a great way to add a bit of width without necessarily having to retract something or pan something. And you could still add chorus and then pan it after the fact. You could still add chorus and, do another take and dub it and pan those out. But this is a great way to add texture and width. And the way that a chorus and flanger and phaser are all kind of working is it's creating new copies of that audio. And with a chorus specifically, it's basically slightly shifting the pitch and slightly shifting the time. I'm using the kilohertz chorus. I'll be using the kilohertz for all of these effects just to kind of show you. But essentially, you're going to just dial in your delay. You'll dial in your depth, which is basically how much you want the delay to vary. And then you'll have your rate, and then you'll have your mix and your spread. So if we pull the stereo spread all the way down, you can kind of hear that it has that out of phase chorusy vibe because it's basically creating 3 versions of this audio that are all slightly out of sync with timing and tuning. If we allow it to spread those though, our ears will start to pick up on that and it will create a wide sound. Pay attention to this meter now. Versus this. And you could even bring the mix down. Let's say you only wanted a little bit of width, but you still want that really strong mono image. So chorus is a great way that I like to add width to things like guitars, things like background vocals, things like cool little synth elements. This is kind of doing something similar to like in something like Serum when you drive up the unison or the voices. It's typically just slightly detuning and offlining that time. And it gives you that kind of chorusy, wide, kind of swirly sound. If we drive this rate and this depth up, you start to get that kind of warble. Because now what we're doing is we still have a bit of that depth to the delay, but the rate is so fast, it's kind of just creating a wobble. Typically, I'll have a slower rate. I'm a big fan of slower rate, lower depth. If we drive this up, it's going to give us a super chorusy sound. And you can see right here, we kind of go in phase, out of phase. I'm not too worried about it unless it's going to be like a main element, but a chorus is a great way to do that. Let's move on to another modulation effect. This one is called a phaser, and it's doing something similar to a chorus, but it's creating all of those copies in a much faster way. A chorus is typically a pretty slow modulation. Phaser is going to be a bit faster, and it'll kind of have this like comb filtering effect, where it'll basically create all of these little peaks and resonances. So this is a big thing with modulation, is not only are you adding width, but you're adding texture. And so you can hear that this kind of has that wow, wow, wow kind of thing that chorus doesn't. And if we drive the rate up, you'll hear it even more. Drive the depth up. So you can kind of play around. Phaser is another great way to just add a little bit of width without it. But if you kind of like the width that a phaser is adding and you don't necessarily want that extra texture and that extra, like filtering sound, just go with something like a chorus. You can hear that a chorus is a lot more kind of mellow of a sound. And then for the last modulation that we'll talk about, we have something called a flanger. Let me show you what this one looks and sounds like. They all kind of operate very similarly, but a flanger is going to be a lot deeper sounding and a bit wetter sounding. I love a flanger for those classic 80s effects. I would say that if you're adding modulation specifically for width, chorus, you can make the most transparent. Phaser, I think that you can kind of tuck it into a mix and it still is not going to be super, you know, taste driven. With a flanger, you're definitely going to get a pretty specific sound. If we drive this mix down, go slower, so with all modulation effects, you kind of have to decide as the producer or engineer or artist what the trade-off is. How much width do you want for the, you know, sound that specific modulation is imparting? If you want to add width and you don't want any of that chorusy, phasey, kind of filtery sound, maybe you move on to something like a time-based effect, or you just go on to your, you know, panning and double tracking and layering. But let's move on to time-based effects. The easiest one is going to be just doing some kind of really short reverb. So here I have the mix at 50% and we have this decay at like 500 milliseconds. I'm just using the dampening just so it doesn't ring out a bunch of high frequencies. And for the size, we have it at 100%. But this is essentially going to operate like a really small room would. And as we know that rooms are 3D space. So you're going to go from a sound that literally just lives right down the middle of a speaker to now adding it into something like a live room. And you can get reverb plugins that go even faster than 500 milliseconds, but if you start getting much faster than that, that's where you will start to run into like that comb filtery, kind of all-pass filter, phasey sound of something like a flanger or a phaser. But if you go for like 400, 500 milliseconds, and you can just have this mix at like, you know, 30% wet, great way to add stereo width. And then the next thing is just kind of doing something like a slapback delay. A delay is basically creating a duplicate signal of the audio. And, you know, if you're using one like a dual delay or a stereo delay, it's going to pan one to one side and one to the other. And as we know, when there are timing discrepancies, our ears pick up on that and it creates stereo width. So for this one, we're doing 40 milliseconds, and then the right side is just 1.6 times that. So what would that be? Probably about 70, 75 milliseconds. We have the spread at 100% because we want a wide stereo signal. And then I've just got this mix at like 45. Without it, if we were to drive this time up, you'll be able to kind of discern a bit more what's happening. And for me personally, I feel like once I get below like 30 milliseconds, it stops getting wide and it starts to kind of phase out. Like, as you can hear, that doesn't really have the same impact or effect as something like 45 milliseconds does. And you can always dial in the spread if you don't want it, you know, super wide on top. Dial the mix down so you can get something a bit more subtle. Even that's adding quite a bit of stereo width over here opposed to this. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is a time-based effect. This is called the HAAS effect. It essentially works just like that delay, but there's no feedback, so it's not creating more than one copy. And it's essentially just having a version of your audio on the left, and then it's making another version, you know, 20, 30 milliseconds on the right, but there's no extra feedback. There's no extra panning. This is essentially doing the same thing as if you just duplicated your track and drug it back 30 milliseconds. And this is a great example of what you might want to be careful with stereo image, is sometimes I'll add the HAAS effect to things that I want to be almost wider than life, super spacey, super ambient and textural. But as you can see right here, we're kind of floating in the negatives. This is pretty out of phase sounding because it's just creating duplicates of the thing, and they're basically starting to phase cancel each other out. If this audio were fully horizontal right here, it's completely out of phase. So as you can see, this is putting out a phase, but maybe that's something that you want. In a mix, that might push it even almost like psychoacoustically wider than 100% left and right. So sometimes I don't need everything to be perfectly phased, or I don't need everything to kind of sum back to mono and be heard on a mono speaker. Sometimes for like a pad or like a really spacey reverb, I'm okay adding something like a HAAS effect or a stereo widener and letting it get literally beyond this left and right and start to almost go out of phase. So that's ways to add with modulation and time-based effects. And the last thing that I want to talk about is a way to make your mix feel wider is just by having a dynamic relationship. You don't want everything in the mix to be wide, because if everything feels wide, then nothing feels wide. That's why I like my kicks and my snares pretty right down the middle. I normally like my lead vocal to be really strong down the middle. And then I'll kind of pick my main, pianos, keys, maybe a guitar pad. I'll kind of have that sit closer to the middle of the stereo spectrum. And then I'll let everything else be wide. I'll let everything else kind of have its own space. And I'll just pay attention to make sure that, my verses don't feel overly wide, so then my chorus doesn't feel super impactful. A great kind of example is, let's take a look at my full mix, and you'll see how much kind of wider we get once we get to a chorus. So if I'm back here, let's pay attention here.
I was never one to lay my cards out on the table till we cross paths.
Now let's get that all the way over to my chorus, and you'll see that it's going to get wider.
It feels like a natural reaction. You had a spark and I caught flame like a matchstick. Instantly bonded that I was never one to lay my cards out on the table till we cross paths.
Having your verse be a little bit more focused, whether that's using less modulation on things, whether that's not panning as many elements, whether that is not going as wide with your panning, I think allows a chorus to feel bigger. A chorus can only feel big if a verse feels small in comparison. If this verse feels huge and wide and 100% left and right, that chorus really has nowhere to go. Another great example is, like, you'll hear people do, like a pull out for a final chorus. Watch how kind of mono and minimal we get, and then watch how wide we get for this final.
But I swear we've got chemistry. It feels like a natural reaction.
Almost fully mono.
You had a spark and I caught flame like a matchstick. Instantly bonded, that's chemical attraction. I guess that's why I'm sticking it. I guess that's why I'm sticking it.
So by playing around with your relationship in your mix and having some things be narrow, some things be completely mono, some things be, completely mono and then otherwise panning them so they don't really have any drift over to the left or the right, that's a great way to kind of make sure that everything still has its own element. You don't want everything fully wide. You don't want everything fully panned out. You don't want everything, fully modulated all the time. Otherwise, it just becomes a wide mess other than a narrow mess. So play around with that. If you like this song, this is a song that I dropped a couple months ago called Hypothesis. I actually made this entire song from start to finish in our Producer Principles Pop production course. So if you want to see me produce this song from start to finish, I think there's like over 200 tracks and layers. The full thing is in that course. I think that course is like over 20 hours. It's wild. It's one of my favorite songs I've ever made. The song is out if you want to stream it, but if you are interested in seeing how to produce this in real time, including like my, mindset when I'm doing things like panning and layering, that course is probably the most in-depth thing that we've ever done and maybe ever even will do. So go check that out. Other than that, hopefully this kind of helped you get wider mixes while still having something that feels punchy and mono compatible. Don't go too wide. Don't go too crazy. Make sure that you leave a comment within the first 72 hours of the video. I will pick the winner on our Instagram. But other than that, that's going to do it for this video, and I'll see you guys soon. Much love. Peace.